In the world of science, it is customary to talk only about the bright sides of the work of scientists, turn a blind eye to many things so that people do not know the truth about the price of greatest discoveries. But today, I want to tell you about the dark pages of history associated with nightmarish experiments on people. My name is Peter Cry. We will dive into the darkest nooks and crannies of the history of scientific experiments and try to understand who are these scientists, monsters or heroes. In the modern world, the so-called Nuremberg Code is created after the horrors of the Second World War. He calls on all the world's countries, authorities and scientists to observe ethical standards when conducting experiments on people. It should be noted that the code concerns ethics related only to voluntary experiments. The Nuremberg Code was created to protect a person from possible bullying and horrors which, despite all the warnings, legal norms and morality still happened for centuries. The Second World War and the lawlessness that was going on then became a real holiday and a feast for psychopathic scientists who wanted to finally put some terrible experiments on a person with impunity. The Nuremberg Code, which became part of the Geneva Convention, appeared precisely after the Second World War, when facts about the terrible crimes committed by scientists in concentration camps and laboratories around the world surfaced. A document that declares the rules of what can and cannot be done during a war. The Geneva Convention and the Nuremberg Code cannot be violated. This is a crime for which an international court can condemn and punish. However, as modernity shows, no one cares about this. That is why both in our time and in the past, even with these many limitations, there have been and will be those who have neglected morality and ethics, exploring the human boundaries of human suffering, and so it was at all times. The worst thing is that science was given to them more than once, and many of us said thank you. Our first scientist is Ivan Pavlov, the famous Russian physiologist and Nobel laureate, made many discoveries regarding the work of the mind and reflexes. To understand how the mind of a living being works, the world luminary of science, Professor Pavlov, began and mainly conducted his experiments on dogs, one of which was even erected a monument thanking her for her contribution to understanding how the body and mind of mammals, including humans, work. The main achievement of Professor Pavlov is that he shared and found out that reflexes in a person and in almost all living beings are divided into two types, conditional and unconditional, that is, laid down by nature and evolution and acquired arising under the influence of certain external factors, including training. It all started with the fact that when the light was turned on in the room, the dog was given something to eat every time. Further, every time the light was turned on, even if the dog was not fed, she still excreted mica copiously, thinking there would be food again. In fact, it was possible to create reflexes in a person and a living being that did not exist before, causing changes in the body's work and behavior. To program a living being for specific actions and behaviors. Alas, no one gives the words for experiments on animals. That is why behind all achievements of Professor Pavlov lies a dark and terrible secret. The thirst for discovery led him further. He decided to experiment on humans. For the discovery to become full-fledged, proven and recognized by the scientific community, it was necessary to check everything that was done with dogs and also on humans. Few people know, but such experiments, very cruel, were carried out, and the material for them was attention. Homeless children. No one needed abandoned orphans after the Civil War. It was full on the poor and hungry streets of cities. Anything could be done with these kids. It was easy to persuade them to do what they were told for a small amount of food and a couple of coins. Under Professor Pavlov's guidance, many unfortunate, hungry children underwent an operation to remove the salivary canal from the cheek to the outside. This operation and experiment were irreversible. It was impossible to embroider this canal back. A transparent jar was attached to the cheek where the salivary canal came out, with which a person had to walk all his life. Saliva dripped into this jar. Professor Pavlov gave all sorts of goodies and sweets to the disfigured operated experiment victims and watched how the transparent jar filled with saliva. They endured suffering for the sake of scientific progress. Professor Pavlov ruined the fate of children by collecting scientific data, which in many ways became a real scientific breakthrough. This data allowed him to write a scientific work for which he received the Nobel Prize. Having discovered that salivation had nothing to do with the presence of food in the mouth, he left forever the victims of his experiments disfigured with a hole in the cheek from which saliva constantly dripped. Without proper medical care, in unsanitary conditions, an infection often gets inside, after which an infection eats a human head, resulting in a painful death. Conditioned and unconditioned reflexes, of course, a great discovery made by Professor Pavlov. It came at monstrous price paid by the Civil War orphans. Thanks to experiments of Professor Pavlov, the whole world, like many mentally ill scientists, knows that by creating new conditioned reflexes, it is possible to program the consciousness, behavior and habits of a person and make him do whatever is needed. Having opened new previously unknown pages for science, he left a gloomy legacy, wounds on the fate of many children. Pretty dark, right? But this is only the beginning of our dark journey into history. What do you think of the other names on the list? Another name on our list of monsters is Wendell Johnson, a psychologist whose actions will forever be remembered by the victims of his brutal research. Wendell Johnson studied semantics, a discipline that deals with the interaction of people among themselves and society. From the age of 5-6, Wendell Johnson himself began to experience speech problems that were not there before. He began to stutter and his problems progressed until he began to lose his speech. Wendell believed that stuttering and speech problems were influenced not so much by biological factors as by the value judgments of people around them. Once, when he was still very young, even when he spoke perfectly, a kindergarten teacher said that a little boy tended to stutter. It was after this incident that Wendell began to have speech problems. Having matured, having become a psychologist, having studied this topic and realizing that to test his theory it is necessary to make an experiment, he decided to act. However, his determination to test his own theories led him to perform a nightmarish experiment that changed the lives of children forever, children who did not deserve this. In January 1939, Wendell Johnson and his assistant arrived at the orphanage. After obtaining permission from the authorities to conduct the experiment, they assembled a group of 22 children. The children were not aware of the true purpose of the experience. They were only told that they would be undergoing speech therapy. The unsuspecting children, whose lives would soon be destroyed, were divided into two groups. For these groups, it was decided to use two approaches to learning and communication. Some children who had problems with speech were told that they had no problems with speech at all. They speak perfectly. Their speech is just music. There are no stutters or speech defects. Friendly teachers played with these children, giving them a lot of attention and helping with everything. They were told daily that despite living and being raised in an orphanage, a great future awaited them. Their path outside the shelter's walls will be easy and full of successful incidents. Surprisingly, this group showed excellent results. Even those children who were afraid and embarrassed to speak due to their stuttering began to gradually eliminate the problems that seemed to have been with them since birth. Monster Wendell Johnson was delighted with the results obtained in the first group. After all, they confirmed all his assumptions. Unfortunately, a terrible fate awaited the second group. In the second group, the teachers told the children they had a tendency to stutter and lose their speech, and if they stutter, it's better for them not to speak at all. To get the desired effect from the experiment, the children were mocked, shouted at, called names, and humiliated. For 5 months, no one was engaged in them. The children became depressed and refused to study. Imagine what an ordeal it was for these little children when their trust and innocence were destroyed in their own orphanage. Already after the second day of experiment, children who had previously spoken perfectly began to experience speech problems. Some children began to stutter, while others became speechless, having difficulty with the ability to say even a word. At the end of the experiment, all the children in the second group had speech problems. The worst thing is that it stays with them for the rest of their lives. Wendell Johnson had a wonderful career that was cut short after the horrific experiment on orphans became known. After the trial, 9 victims of this experiment were paid almost $1 million each. But this did not save them from the disease and the memories of the terrible experiment that crippled their lives forever. Terrible, isn't it? But this is yet to be the tip of the iceberg, where science exceeded all ethical and moral standards. Sidney Gottlieb is an American chemist who became the founder of the MK Ultra project and a person whose life and work were shrouded in a mess of secrets and mysteries. In 1959, he began working for the CIA, wanting to create the perfect truth serum, a certain chemical substance thanks to which, after entering the human body, it would be possible to get any information from it without long interrogations and torture. To create such a substance that makes a person talk, affecting all the defense mechanisms of the psyche, it was simply impossible to use as an experimental animal. Thus, in 1953, Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA launched a multi-year project. This project was called MK Ultra. Sidney Gottlieb used LSD and other psychedelic substances during experiments on people who did not know that they were being experimented on. Unaware of this, the victims in horror thought they were going crazy. The victims were stuffed with psychotropic drugs and injected into an insulin coma that lasted tens of days. At this time, the victims could be in the headphones, where the words sounded non-stop. Your mother hates you, or you must kill a certain politician. Thousands of people who fell into the hands of Sidney Gottlieb became victims of these terrible experiments. Homeless people, beggars, alcoholics, and those who had no relatives turned out to be the main material for MK Ultra. Their defenseless and social isolation allowed the experimenters to plunge them into hell. Gottlieb and his collaborators managed to induce amnesia in an unsuspecting person for a certain period. That is, the subject could commit a crime or survive terrible violence, and a specific piece of time was cut out of his memory during which this happened, after which the experiment victim did not remember anything. 2 cases are known when other personalities were planted in women's minds which they never were. Moreover, to one of the women completely erased her personality and instilled a new one with a full-fledged history of many years. She defeated herself and said it was her and she had never been anyone else. After that, the new personality was erased and the old real one returned. After being erased, the subject did not remember anything about it. In one case, a diligent family man broke into someone else's house and killed a girl there. He was found walking down the street, covered in blood. He claimed he did not remember anything about what happened. Subsequently, it became known that the psychologist whom this man regularly visited in the past worked for the MK Ultra project. The experiment victim could become a murderer or a rapist and then remember nothing about it. Imagine the horror of knowing that one day you did something monstrous that cannot be forgiven. An excellent plot for the thriller, which I embodied in my book Monster, the story of a maniac, makes this story a real bestseller with many positive reviews. This psychological thriller will be a real revelation for those who love an incredible story. I strongly recommend that you familiarize yourself with this story. I will attach a link to the book in the description under this video. But what if I told you that Sidney Gottlieb's, however strange it may sound, will seem a harmless angels compared to those waiting for us ahead? Sigmund Rasche, a German doctor, was an employee of the great mysterious organization Ahnenerbe, which in addition to official activities was engaged in the search and study of lost magical texts, rituals and artifacts. The people who worked in Ahnenerbe were obsessed with black magic and mysticism. Sigmund Rasche had made a brilliant career in Nazi Germany. Before becoming a true monster, he worked in several concentration camps where he had a huge amount, as he said, of material for conducting unimaginably cruel experiments. Of course, as in the cases with monsters before, we are talking about innocent people. The tasks of Sigmund Rasche included finding out what effect extremely low temperatures and extreme altitudes had on the soldiers of the Third Reich. Later, after experiments, he had to develop an algorithm for helping soldiers who suffered from frostbite and extreme heights. Even now, in modern extreme medicine, his achievements are used to save people's lives. Once, to find out what happens to a person at high altitudes and ultra-low temperatures, thousands of people died a very cruel and painful death. Sigmund Rasche had no problems with the supply of test subjects, which could be destroyed in any quantity so as not to destroy pure Aryan blood. However, his path became an absolute nightmare when he ended up in the Dachau concentration camp. For the experiment simulating the rarefied air of a pilot who had risen to an extreme height in the order to have enough data, 200 concentration camp prisoners were driven inside the pressure chamber, of which 80 people died immediately at the initial stage of the experiment. Air was pumped out of the pressure chamber, simulating the atmosphere at an altitude of 21 kilometers. The blood of the test subjects inside the chamber literally boiled. Those who survived were disabled for life. In addition, Rasche sought to understand how the human body reacts to cold icy water. Many of the Dachau prisoners who participated in the experiments were doused with cold water and then taken out into the cold, bringing the person to a dying state. The subject was then brought back and hot water was poured over him to see what effort it would have. Many people were immersed in a bath of very cold water in various positions. Someone was immersed up to the neck, someone only by the back of the head. Rusher also often practiced cold burns, after which he tried to make the state of the limbs regain its normal healthy state. Rusher conducted the experiments as calmly as possible, ignoring the suffering of the experimental subjects. Thousands of prisoners of the Second World War became victims of his ruthless experiments. During the Nuremberg trials after the end of the war, Rusher's experiments were recognized as inhuman. He was one of those because of whom the Nuremberg Code appeared. Rusher's life ended in a concentration camp in the Third Reich. There he was a prisoner. His own regime shot the scientist in the back of the head. Yes, it's amazing, but he became a victim of those for whom he worked and who he was for many years. The fact is that Rusher's wife had something wrong with blood. The blood was not exactly Aryan, and she could not have children. All women of the Third Reich, especially those whose husbands are employees of the Ahnenerbe, should have birth to Aryan children, as many as possible. Sigmund Rusher promised Hitler that he would make it so that the women of the Third Reich would be able to give birth to children without problems until old age, up to 80 years. Each of them will have a couple of dozen children in a stable life for the benefit of the Aryan Empire. But he didn't keep his promise. Having fallen into disgrace of Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, his fate was a foregone conclusion, and he was executed after a certain period of staying in concentration camp as a prisoner. What a fair irony! But no matter how unfounded it may sound, this person was not even close to the scientist you will now learn about, Shiro Ishii. Would you believe it if you knew that the most terrifying of all the psychopathic scientists who did the most horrifying human experiments ever got immunity after his experiments was exposed? Would you believe it if you knew that he lived peacefully and died? However, the most terrible monster did not pay for his crimes during his lifetime, although everyone knew who he was, where he lived, and what he had done. A Japanese doctor named Shiro Ishii once headed a nightmarish organization called Unit 731, and for a time was even the chief medical officer of the entire Japanese army. To divert ice, Unit 731 deal with the problems of cleaning water, but in fact this organization was engaged in the creation of bacteriological weapons, as well as all sorts of cruel experiments on people whose content is beyond the human imagination. General of the Imperial Japanese Army, Shiro Ishii once traveled to Europe to study the development of the bacteriological weapons. Upon his return, he was extremely encouraged by the findings. Having filed a petition and received permission to develop biological weapons, Shiro Ishii began his monstrous journey. Everyone knows that a person is 80% water, but to be precise, 78%. This was discovered thanks to an experiment where a person was placed in a special hermetic dry chamber where warm air was constantly forced up to 122 degrees. Still alive but immobilized in the chamber, the man at first sweated and then began to dry out, losing all moisture and turning into an exhausted mummy. The death of the test subject in such an experiment was long and very painful. However, after this, world learned that only 22% of the human body's mass is organs, muscles, skin and bones. Everything else is water. For this discovery, the world says thank you to Shiro Ishii and his Unit 731. Those who worked and helped Shiro Ishii in Unit 731 used to call the prisoners used for their inhuman experiments logs. The attitude of the Imperial Army towards them was appropriate. Some cruel experiments that Unit 731 carried out are difficult to imagine and understand. People were tied to the poles at the training ground, some in clothes, some naked. A bomb exploded nearby, stuffed with pathogens of gas gangrene and plague fleas. After that, the time was measured, after which the fleas would reach the victim and infect the victim. In addition, Shiro Ishii often practiced the dissection of a living person. This is when, without the use of anesthesia, a person was opened and organs were taken out of him one by one. First the stomach, then the liver, then the heart and brain. All biological weapons created by the Unit 731 were immediately tested on living people. As a result, after the end of the Second World War, the scientist maniac Shiro Ishii was arrested. However, behind bars he happened to be quite a bit of time. Having agreed with the Americans, he made a deal, the condition of which was to give all his knowledge and all the secret information based on the results of his inhuman experiments. Thanks to this, he received immunity and the opportunity to live and work in Japan, remaining a very respected person. At the Nuremberg trials, the USSR authorities demanded that Shiro Ishii be handed over to them, since many nightmarish experiments were carried out on Soviet and Chinese prisoners of war. But this demand was denied. Many people more qualified to be monsters who worked tirelessly for knowledge in Unit 731 were not punished. Ishii himself subsequently converted to Christianity and even became a Catholic. Apparently, bloody memories and remorse did not prevent him from doing this. Usually, the human god, according to the monsters, forgives them for every crime they have committed. The history of humanity is full of secrets and mysteries. Maybe now we are part of some cruel global experiment without realizing it. We may be puppets in the hands of mysterious forces trying to control our minds and lives. Maybe there's something big behind it, a mystery that changes everything. In my videos, I open people's eyes to those incidents that the forces remaining in the shadows are trying to hide carefully. Go ahead, watch these videos. See you!